Immigrants, or the word and meaning of immigrants, have changed over time, but not just over time. The meaning have changed with people. So immigrants were white Europeans. They came here to establish the United States for them. They were the citizens. Everyone else were not included within that nation. So the first group of non-Europeans were Africans who were brought from Africa in 1619 to work on the plantations of the New World. Those enslaved laborers were migrant workers in the sense that they were brought for a specific task to be exploited to enrich the nation, to enrich the white settlers. Over time, Mexicans were engulfed by the expanding United States. In 1848, Mexico's territories were annexed by the United States. Mexicans thus became U.S. citizens within the U.S. territory. When the United States wanted more laborers, they imported Asians. Asians replaced African Americans as workers in some of the fields in the United States. Those groups of people were not like the original European settlers. They were seen as workers to work for the white settlers. Immigrants are generally paid lower wages than citizens, largely because these are migrant workers. They're migrant laborers. And migrant laborers were people of color, whether they were Mexicans or Africans or Asians. They were brought to the United States to work. Now, the idea was that they would be cheap workers. First of all, Africans were enslaved and they worked for nothing. They didn't own their own labor. Asians were brought as indentured workers. That is, they signed contracts to work for a certain number of years, for certain wages, for certain work conditions. So those rules by which the United States prospered was predicated on cheap migrant labor. Why they were cheap was because they were enslaved and indentured. Okay, within the United States, migrant labor was paid less because of various laws. The laws, for example, against Africans becoming citizens of the United States. The laws which enabled enslavement of African bodies. The laws that regulated Asian workers to indentures which specified their incomes, their salaries. Those laws were institutionalized to preserve the white settler, the nation, as a white state. So, for example, in the U.S. Constitution, the first Constitution of the nation, in Article 1, it said that the citizens were Europeans and Africans were 3/5 all other persons. The Naturalization Act of 1790 said naturalization is limited to free white persons. That white racial state is what we see today in the Trump phenomenon. The institutions of the United States work to regulate migration. So whenever the United States felt that there were too many, say, Asians, they passed what was called exclusion laws to prevent entry into the United States by Chinese in 1882, Japanese in 1908, and so forth and so forth. Mexicans also were prevented from coming across the border when the United States did not want their labor. But when the United States wanted their labor, they encouraged them to come over. So for example, in the 1940s and 50s, there was called the Bracero program, which brought Mexicans from Mexico into the United States. And when their work was finished, they were expected to return to Mexico. Now, the point here is that the laws of the United States regulated the entry of these people. Okay, all right. So how the laws operated around immigration is the control of people of color, essentially, because there was no laws while Europeans came. Until the late 19th century, when Europeans from the South, Southern Europeans, Italians, Greeks, and so forth, and from the East, then laws were instituted in 1924 that restricted entry to certain groups of Europeans while encouraging the entry of Northern Europeans, which the United States wanted. Let me also then say that during economic times, because people of color were required for labor, their entry and exit was regulated by law. So when I mentioned the Bracero program in the 1940s and 1950s, they were needed for work in the agricultural fields. But in the 1950s, they were seen as excess labor. So in the 1950s, the government began a program of expulsion of Mexicans and Mexican Americans that took about 1 million of Mexican and Mexican Americans across the border. Now, in our time, since 911, I don't know if you guys can remember 911, huh? There was a heightened interest in immigrants and migrants because they saw them as subversive, terrorists, and other things. It also is instructive to understand that the US economy did not want them during this period. So there was increased talk about border controls and the expulsion of so-called illegal immigrants. There's no such thing as an illegal immigrant, right? Because an immigrant is a person. There is no such thing as an illegal human being. What we're talking about are people without documents, so we call them undocumented people. In our current time, white nationalism is on the rise. White nationalism means a return to the origins of the United States as a white settler state, expulsion of people of color. And that is why today, under this regime of white nationalism, there is increased demands for the expulsion of the undocumented workers. The question about immigrants and the US economy is a complex one, but it's also a simple one. The simple one is that when the economy requires laborers, it encourages the entry of these workers. And when the economy does not do well and it doesn't want these workers, it encourages them to go back from where they came. Now, generally, immigrants thus benefit the economy because they're needed, and they also provide the services that maybe native-born people would not want. For example, agricultural work, cleaning our homes and offices, and so forth. Less desirable work. They also are drawn from countries where the standard of living is lower. So say in Central America, people would work for lower wages there. When they come to the United States, they could work for lower wages because their employers would pay them less. It's not that these people don't want more money, they came here to make money and they would want to, but being undocumented or being targeted by ICE and the immigration officials, they are susceptible. They cannot protest and demand their rights. Well, under the Donald, he is expanding enforcement of existing immigration laws. Existing immigration laws require the expulsion of undocumented immigrants. Under the prior administration, it is true that President Obama expelled a record number of undocumented migrants. But it is also true that President Obama passed DACA, which allowed for the dreamers, people who were born outside as children, brought to the United States, and they were reared in the United States and educated within the United States, enabled them to stay in the United States. What the difference is under the Donald, there is greater enforcement. There is talk of ICE and joining with, meaning these are federal agents, joining with local police to round up undocumented immigrants and thereby split families, removing, say, mothers and fathers from their children who are American born and thus American citizens.